Please do take your seats. And if you'd like to turn back to that passage, Luke chapter 23, we're going to think a little bit more about it together, just as the kids are next door. Like I said, it is the heart of Easter. It's the heart of the Christian message. And obviously and wonderfully, that swap that happens, that second thief, who, unable to do anything except cry out to Jesus, is assured that he is going to be accepted by God, is the amazing and wonderful heart of Easter. But of course, there's another thief, another criminal, another guy on the cross who misses out. So right at the moment of wonder and glory is also this terrible tragedy. He could have done the same thing as that second guy. He could have reached out to Jesus and said, "Remember me." But he doesn't. And I suppose what I want to think a little bit about together for the next few minutes is, well, I suppose how it is that he does miss out and how we can avoid it ourselves and how anyone can avoid what that first thief experiences. It seems to me, as you sort of go through the passage, there are three issues or three areas in which, if you get it wrong, if you like, about Jesus, you're in danger of going the way of that first thief rather than that second. The first area is in your, what you might call your assessment of Jesus. Because if you listen to what that first thief says, well, it's verse 39 if you look down there. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." The reason that he doesn't sort of, if you like, get the insight, that on the face of it, the reason that's stopping him is that issue that he has. He's mocking Jesus with those words, not accepting and receiving him like the second thief. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." And you might think, well, what does that mean? How does that work? How could we say the same sort of thing to Jesus? Two things about that to notice. Number one, he's really echoing what lots of people around the cross are saying. And in particular, two groups who in many ways wouldn't agree on anything at all, but they agree on this. The first group are the religious leaders. That's in verse 35. The rulers of the Jewish people. They sneered at him. They said, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is God's Messiah." If he is the promised, chosen king of God's people that we've been waiting for so long, he can't be dying on a cross. He should save himself. It's the same sort of thing as that first thief is saying. So the religious leaders are saying the same thing, and so are the soldiers. Verse 36 and verse 37, the soldiers also came up and mocked him, and they said, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." Now, in each of these cases, they are sort of looking at Jesus with slightly different lenses. The religious leaders thinking he's going to be the religious leader, the great king of God's people. The soldiers saying, well, you're supposed to be a political ruler. You're supposed to be the king of the Jews. That's not how kings behave. This is not how kings end their lives. But it's so striking that these two groups, which in many ways are like poles apart, your sort of keenest religious observer and your out-and-out hardened atheist, if you like, or no-nonsense soldier. And yet both of them look at the cross and say the same sort of thing. You shouldn't be there if you're this great leader that people say you are. I don't think it's an accident that Luke records those two guys, those two groups saying that, and then, if you like, cuts to the first thief, and lo and behold, he's saying the same thing. Because there is something about the cross of Jesus Christ which, if you like, anyone and everyone will just find impossible to believe. Every human being, wherever they're coming from, will look at the cross and their first reaction will be, that is senseless. There is nothing about this which is sort of what we expect a Messiah, a ruler, a leader, a hero to go through. You can't help feeling that at some level the first thief is just being swept along, if you like, in a current with what everyone else is saying. I think there's a lesson for us in that. Being a Christian, if you like, has never been the sort of easy option that goes with the flow. For that second thief to look at Jesus and say anything other than, you can't be the Christ. Well, that takes, if you like, an enormous amount of, God's work, but from that man's point of view, believing in the face of what he sees with his own eyes. Or at the very least, believing in the face of what the whole rest of the world is telling him. But just think a little bit as well about what that first thief and what those soldiers and what those religious leaders, what they're actually saying with that sort of save yourself and not us thing. Now, in one sense, it's just mockery. There's no way you can be the Christ, the Messiah, the King of the Jews. But in another sense, if there is any seriousness in their claim or their question to Jesus there, then what they're basically saying is, I know how God ought to act in the world. I know how it ought to look like when God shows up, and it shouldn't look like that. And that, I think, maybe sort of cuts to the heart of how people today can miss out on Jesus Christ. Because we can come to him and think, I already know somewhere in my mind how it all ought to go. If God's going to be at work in the world, be at work in my life. And as soon as it doesn't look like that, in whatever way, this can't really be God at work. This can't be God active in the world, either in Jesus Christ or in my own life. Now, when you start to think about that for a second, you think about what we're sort of saying, or what these people are saying, and what anyone's saying when they say this sort of thing, it doesn't make a lot of sense to say, I'll believe in God, I'll accept God if he acts like I think he should. An all-powerful, all-knowing, all-seeing, all-loving God who will fit in with my agenda. That doesn't make sense on its sort of, logically on its own terms. A God who should agree with me all the time. But that, I think, if there is something going on under the surface beyond just pure mockery, for all these groups of people, they have an idea about what God should look like when he comes into the world, and Jesus doesn't meet it. And so you see the tragedy. They're all missing out on what could so easily be theirs. That's what I mean, our assessment of Jesus. If we come to Jesus expecting and almost telling him how he ought to behave, when he doesn't behave like that, like this first thief, we can end up mocking him when life is just an inch away. Forgiveness, belonging to God. So that's the first area in which, if you like, this thief misses out, and if you like, he gives us a model of how anyone can miss out. The second area, if we sort of look at the second thief, though, the second area is a sort of assessment of ourselves. Because the striking thing about this second thief, as well as what he says to Jesus, is what he says about himself. So the other criminal in verse 40 rebuked him. Don't you fear God, he said, since you are under the same sentence. We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong. Now we know from the Gospels and from Luke as well, that these guys dying here, they're very likely freedom fighters. They're people who have spent their lives fighting against the tyranny of the Roman state. And so it's not as simple as saying this man is like, well, we are being punished justly by this Roman state. At the end of his life, he suddenly has this realization that Rome is the good guy all along and everything's fine. He comes to a deeper realization about himself, that even in the midst of being killed by the Roman state, he is still before God getting what his deeds deserve. That before God, he is deserving of being cut off from God, being separated from him. And, however his life is going at the end, however his death comes about, in one sense, this isn't unjust. We're getting what our deeds deserve. As a human being in God's world, he doesn't deserve to go and be with God. He doesn't deserve to have God in his life. What he deserves is to be cut off from God. Now, even as I say that, I'm guessing you find it hard to believe that. We all find it hard to believe. And we have to be careful not to say at this point, if you think about it, we're all like criminals being executed by the Roman state. Look at how bad we are. The Bible gives a very nuanced account, if you like, of the human situation. But in each of our lives, in all kinds of different ways, one thing we've been seeing over the weeks, both in the book of Exodus and in here in Luke, is that however it looks like for each of us, we're all, if you like, dethroning God, putting something else in the place of God in the center of our lives. That is a subtle thing. Sometimes we don't even realize we're doing it. But if we kind of honestly assess what's going on in our hearts, then each of us is doing that in our own way. And unless we can admit that, and unless we can admit, like this second thief, that in whatever way my life is going before God, I don't deserve anything but to be cut off from him, then we're never going to have hands empty enough to come and receive what God has for us. We're never going to have hands empty enough to receive forgiveness from Jesus Christ. That's the astounding thing here, that this man admits, I don't deserve to have anything from you, but please remember me anyway. Now, we might be thinking at this point, there is a scandal here. There is almost, or a problem. Because if we take seriously what happens to this guy, that he isn't a kind of innocent guy who Jesus says, oh yeah, you're on my team, don't worry about it. But he's a wicked man who deserves nothing but God's judgment, being cut off from God, and yet Jesus welcomes him anyway. We might well be thinking, this is grossly unfair. And if you think about, well, bring it into our own day and to people who we know are deeply wicked, and you don't have any kind of cover-up, it's abundantly clear. We might find it impossible to think that this is a fair thing, a kind thing for God to do. You might have seen this week, you might even have watched it. There was a new documentary that came out about Jimmy Savile on Netflix. And it's called A British Horror Story. And it recounts, as best as we can, on the basis of all the evidence that's come to light, the deep, deep, wicked darkness of Jimmy Savile's life and deeds. There was a review in The Guardian. Lucy Mangan wrote a review, and here's how it ended. Savile believed in hell and spoke often, without naming his debits, of his hope that his charity work would balance the books. Never. Let us hope hell exists. It was a really striking moment in the review, the way the review ended. I think we'd all agree with it. In the face of that sort of wickedness, what else is there to say other than God punished that man for the crimes he's done? Could it really be possible that, like that second thief, towards the end of his life, if Jimmy Savile got over the fact that he was trying to kind of make up with his charity for all the things he'd done, he could say to Jesus, remember me, and Jesus would welcome him in? Could that really be possible? Maybe this is the reason that lots of people today actually would, if you like, miss out on Jesus. They think this is just unfair. This is scandalous. Which is why we need to just think finally about the third way in which we might miss out on what this second thief gets in on. So our assessment of Jesus, our assessment of ourselves, thirdly and finally, our assessment of, if you like, the cost of Jesus' sacrifice. Because here's the thing about that second thief. He doesn't get the welcome into God's kingdom because right at the last, God suddenly, if you like, lowers the bar of justice and says, okay, yeah, you can come in. In our heads, I guess that's something like what we think God is doing. Or we think that's like, what we imagine God might do in the case of a Jimmy Savile. And we think that's ridiculous, that's scandalous. The scandal of the cross is that neither God's justice nor God's love is in any way compromised. Because Jesus, if you like, goes to hell in place of that second thief. And so when he offers life to him and paradise to him, it's because he is bearing the full cost of that himself. And though it is scandalous, and it is hard to accept that, if you like, the most wicked person could get in on this themselves, if only they turn to Jesus and say, remember me. Well, I suppose that scandal, that difficulty of believing it, shows we don't understand the deep, deep depth of the price that Jesus paid. Let me finish with the story of another wicked, wicked man, Larry Nassar. You might have heard of his story. It was brought to light particularly through the work of Rachel Den Hollander. Rachel Den Hollander was a gymnast in the US gymnast team growing up as a teenager. And she was the first one who really blew the whistle on one of her coaches, Larry Nassar, and his vast and deep wickedness in abusing girls in the US gymnast team as they were going through. Den Hollander was the first to raise the alarm, and she has fought and advocated for victims of Nassar. And she was one of the people who spoke with great eloquence. She was the last person to give her impact statement at his trial, where he was convicted of multiple offences of the most terrible and wicked nature. I just want to read for you part of her statement where she's speaking directly to Nassar himself. She said this: "In our early hearings, you brought your Bible into the courtroom, and you have spoken of praying for forgiveness. But Larry, if you have read the Bible you carry, you know forgiveness doesn't come from doing good things as if good deeds can erase what you have done. It comes from repentance, which requires facing and acknowledging the truth about what you have done in all of its utter depravity and horror, without mitigation, without excuse, without acting as if good deeds can erase what you have seen in this courtroom today. The Bible you carry speaks of a final judgment where all of God's wrath and eternal terror is poured out on men like you. Should you ever reach the point of truly facing what you have done, the guilt will be crushing. And that is what makes the gospel of Christ so sweet, because it extends grace and hope and mercy where none should be found. And it will be there for you. I pray you experience the soul-crushing weight of guilt, so you may someday experience true repentance and true forgiveness from God, which you need far more than forgiveness from me, though I extend that to you as well." I think in the end that is the answer to that question. How could God forgive the very worst people we know? What does God have to say to Lucy Mangan? Let us hope hell exists. It does. And Jesus went to it on behalf of anyone who puts their trust in him. so that whether they're a Jimmy Savile or a Larry Nassar, or an ordinary person like you or me, Jesus' death is sufficient to cover the depth of our guilt before God. And if we see that depth, and if, like the second thief, we admit it, then whoever we are, whatever we've done, however bad you are, Jesus welcomes you in without lowering the bar of justice one bit. Now, I don't pretend that that is not scandalous. Not scandalous to think that there's nothing that you need to do. All of us want to say, okay, but surely there'd be a need to kind of, prove you've really done it, prove you've really repented. The second thief has no option to sort of prove that. He just can cry out with his hands pinned. There's nothing he can do except say, Jesus, remember me. God is a God of complete justice, and he isn't in the business of just passing over the depth of the human problem. But for every one of us, there is available the welcome, paradise. So that's how we don't miss out, by getting Jesus right, by understanding ourselves right, and by getting the cost, understanding the depth of Jesus' sacrifice for us. Let's be quiet for a few moments, and then I'm going to lead us in prayers of intercession. But let's have a few moments of quiet to reflect on these things for ourselves.